claim that the Russians are doing well or that they're not suffering losses of a significant size, it's just silly.
The news headlines were all dominated by the Russian incursions into NATO that continue to this day, and NATO's limited response, if at all. Is Russia probing NATO defenses?
Russians are running out of tanks, running out of rations, running out of missiles, fighting with shovels. They have no morale. This is the reality that Western mainstream media has been trying to shovel, but it's the reality on the battlefield.
Come on. The Russians are really going to go head-to-head with the whole of the NATO alliance, right? The biggest problem with spending all your money on defense expenditure is it doesn't have any longer-term supply-side effects. That's the basics of economic.
Pyotr suggested that this conflict was ultimately going to be decided by economy. The Kiev regime has no economy.
Days after a major corruption scandal in Ukraine that included Zelensky's inner circle and a sabotage of Polish railway that supplies aid to Ukraine, we have a peace plan on the table. And that includes Ukraine giving up territory, significant territory, halving its military, giving up access to long-range weapons, and no foreign troops, no peacekeeping force on their territory to give them security guarantees. And Ukraine doesn't even have a seat on the table in these negotiations. Today, I sit with Pyotr Kurzin and Mark Sleboda to go through the peace plan and the latest developments on the ground, as well as the scandal and the attack that happened in Poland. I hope you enjoy the conversation. It was good to see you again, Pyotr. Long time. Mark, pleasure to meet you, sir.
Nice to meet you as well.
And thank you for your time. So I'm going to kick it off with the leaks of a potential peace plan by, I think it was Axios that came up with the leak. And the more time went, the more it seemed that it's legitimate. So the leak included the following points. It's a 28-point plan by Trump. It was leaked by Politico or Axios. I can't remember which one it was. So it includes the following. Ukraine would withdraw from Donetsk and Lugansk. Sorry, Ukraine would withdraw from Donetsk and Lugansk. Russia will freeze the lines of Kherson and Zaporizhia and withdraw from Kharkov and Sumy. That's the territory. Militarily, Ukraine will cut its military in half, give up access to long-range weapons, and no foreign troops. That includes the UK-French-led coalition. What is it called? The Coalition of the
Willing.
Third, neutrality. Ukraine will not join NATO, remaining neutral, and it will be allowed to join the EU. And lastly, it will recognize the Russian as an official language and grant formal status to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So there's a lot to discuss here. We'll start discussing the points within the plan before discussing other aspects of it and the response from the various parties. But Pyotr, give us your initial reaction. Do you think this is a feasible plan? And it seems similar to the leaks that came up when Trump met Zelensky but spoke to Putin the day before. And there were leaks about a similar deal that included freezing the lines. And apparently Zelensky did not like the deal and they had a pretty heated conversation face to face. Wasn't confirmed, but it seems that the plan now is very similar.
Well, I'm not entirely sure what there is to leak here, Mario, to be honest. It's exactly the same proposals that have been put forward by the Russian side since the war fully took off, if you like, in 2022. The Russians have always had more or less 6 maximalist demands, which is the inclusion of the Russian language in the constitution, the preservation of Russian Orthodoxy religion, the demilitarization, denazification, no foreign troops, and the essential capitulation of the Ukrainians by giving up the territory that Russia already controls. Now, in my opinion, the Russians, since they failed in the initial goal of the 10 days to force the removal of Zelensky and turn Ukraine into sort of a Belarus 2.0, is to take what's known as Novorossiya, which is Russian for New Russia, which was an area of eastern and southern Ukraine, which was essentially conquered by Catherine the Great, or Catherine the Great in the late 1700s, I think it was. And this is obviously where this strong emphasis of Russia's relationship or right to, or the rights of the Russian minorities or Russian-speaking peoples in eastern Ukraine dwells from. But these latest demands, there's nothing really different here. I think the partial demilitarization of Ukraine is really the only notable change, because usually it's full demilitarization. But I'm not really surprised. There's a reason I haven't really covered it much, because I don't think Ukraine's going to reject it. Trump wants any kind of win because he's he's put his legacy or a lot of his reputation. He's pissed about not getting the Nobel Peace Prize. And lastly, obviously, Putin is doing this to continue to fan the flames of his domestic audience and legacy or whatever reputation, whilst continuing to actually push towards Pokrovsky, which is costing the Russians and the Ukrainians a lot. Very last point is that personally, Russia can take all of Donetsk. It's very important for the fortress belt, and they can also take what's the other major one, Luhansk. But Sumy, Zaporizhia, Kherson, those oblasts, Russia controls 60%. But that's not enough to garner complete capitulation by the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are not going to give in.
So you've called this deal capitulation, though. If Ukraine accepts it, that is considered capitulation.
But they're not going to. Yeah, of course it would be capitulation, but the Ukrainians.
But do they have? But the question, and Mark, my question to you is: does Ukraine have a choice? Ukraine will not be able to continue this war with European support without American support as well. And if Americans are negotiating directly with Russia, isn't America saying that we will no longer support the war if Ukraine does not accept this deal?
Okay, well, first of all, I mean, this is a proxy regime in Kiev. It was brought to power at an illegal, violent putsch, right? And it exists solely on U.S. sufferance. So if the U.S. decides to shut this obscene little show down, then it will be shut down. There's really no question about that. It's just a matter of infighting, shall we say, in the West between the Trump administration and the European powers that are still bent on, shall we say, a more orthodox view of U.S.-led Western global hegemony and what its relations with Russia should be. With regards to this leak, I'm willing to believe the Trump administration is once again trying to push what they consider a peace plan. I also agree, although maybe not for the same reasons with Pyotr, that this is completely unfeasible and the conflict will continue until its resolution on the battlefield. But while there is some broad strokes that have a degree of likelihood to it, it's in the details. I mean, absolutely ridiculous things like the Telegraph reporting a lease of Russia paying a lease of the Donbass. Russia returning or allowing the rest of Kherson and Zaporozhye to maintain under the control of the Kiev regime. When it's already been included in the Russian constitution, which would be completely politically, domestically unacceptable in Russia. I think that there's some serious disinformation in this leak, as we've seen previously in the Western mainstream media when discussions of supposed peace plans. And I think part of the intention to do so is by certain elements, both within the U.S., the greater, shall we say, the blob, the deep state, but also from the Europeans to sink any real chance. Not that there's any real chance. I don't think there is. But, I guess they're playing to be on the shore side.
So Piotr, I'll let you respond, especially with Mark's point about this being a proxy regime, which begs the question, who is calling the shots here? And how much influence does the EU actually have, considering they weren't part of these negotiations? And again, they're not too happy about it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I used to, in the earlier phases of the war, be outright like, this is not a proxy war, but that was because I was a little bit more just like many people, very overwhelmed by what we'd actually seen developing. But in an essence, it is to a certain extent. I don't think it's unfair to say that what this war represents is a greater power struggle between the United States and Russia. It's obviously changed since Trump has come in. He sees the world through a similar lens like Putin or President Xi Jinping. This whole idea of might is right, or the mighty nations tell the smaller nations what to do and they don't have a choice in the matter. But I do think that Trump is flip-flopping. He does this all the time. It's taco. There's a reason why he likes, he's trying to illustrate to his supporter base, because at the moment we've got infighting in MAGA with Marjorie Taylor Greene and all that sort of malarkey. So what's he trying to do? He's trying to demonstrate to his voter base that he is doing something over Ukraine. But this isn't going to move the goalposts, right? This is not, the war is not going to be won on the battlefield. We can come to that probably later on in the debate, but they want to be seen to be doing something. And in my opinion, I do think that the European Union, for all the slack that it gets, is increasingly taking up efforts to be more strategically autonomous. Do I think it's doing it well or quickly enough? No. But I think the biggest mistake the Europeans have ever had was being overly dependent on any of the big three powers. America for security assurances, China for cheap markets, and Russia for cheap gas or energy. And I think that Europe needs to step up, and I think they are in their relative ways. We've just seen the provocations in the North Sea between the Russians and the British, which I've made a video on. And, the point I'm making is that I think I don't think this ultimately comes down to just the United States and Russia. Sure, of course, they do engage directly, and the Europeans are with the foreign secretary, I forget her name, Kaja Kalin or whatever her name is, making outrageous things. How dare they exclude us? But they're going to. This is the Trump administration's view of the world, and it's the Putin preference of the way of doing things. So I'm not surprised, but I do think Europe is stepping up in ways that will be able to supplant America if needed.
But if this is a proxy war between the US and Russia, I'd say even the US and China to an extent. China's funding Russia's war to a large degree. But if this is a proxy war, then wouldn't the US decide whether to accept this deal or not? How much say does Ukraine actually have?
They can. Of course, they can. But as I said, Trump's been pissed off by Putin's messing him about. And I think whilst he's promised the tomahawks but then not followed through, he does continue to supply Ukraine. There's a lot of, supplies that are going through Poland, going through the Baltics, going through Romania, which aren't always covered, right? This is menial news that is not going to be interesting to the main people who don't focus on as much as we do on a daily basis. Point being is that I just don't think Trump's going to fully pull out, because if he does, that's going to be a huge cost to American business with Russia's provocations across Europe, which will affect his interests. And it would also be just a logistically complicated thing to do. You've got 30,000 plus troops in Germany alone. You've got plenty of logistical support in Eastern Europe, which would be costly. Again, they can, but I don't think it would make much sense. And ultimately, the British or the Americans, I think the Europeans could, if really pushed, supplement, as I say, replace some of those things. Not all of it, definitely not the logistical side, but I think they could cover America's offensive and defensive capabilities if they really, really needed to. But I don't think Europeans ever fear that's ever going to happen. But that's
Mark, your thoughts on whether this deal will pass through, and more importantly, on whether Trump is actually pulling out of the eastern flank, NATO's eastern flank, and focusing more on China?
Yeah. So I agree with Pyotr that the Trump administration is, if you want to say waffling or flip-flopping, it has no coherent policy. I mean, not really just with regards to the conflict in Ukraine, but no coherent foreign policy in general. There is obviously extreme.
So Mark, on that point, is that a bad thing if you don't have a coherent foreign policy? Isn't it good sometimes to be unpredictable during negotiations when people don't know what chips you hold and what your position is?
I don't think it's so much that the other side doesn't know what you want. It's a problem when you don't know what you want, when there's no agreement between your own administration, right? I mean, Trump, he visions himself as some kind of emperor of the United States, or God emperor of mankind, or however he views himself. And he likes people to come and pay court to him, to come to his court and pay court. And he likes them to present different arguments, different perspectives, and then he chooses amongst those. The problem is that he changes his mind every 15 minutes, according to the last person he talked to. And there are people of wildly different foreign policy vision. Let's talk J.D. Vance versus Marco Rubio within his own administration. And that has led to Trump going one way and then going the other way and then going back again and then doing 180, or a Annalena Baerbock 360 if you want. And there's no coherent policy here. That's why he has tilted towards the Kyiv regime in Ukraine, tilted towards Russia, and back and forth. And right now, I mean, the appearances, at least the way it's presented in the Western mainstream media, is that Trump is tilting towards the Russian perspective in this conflict. At the same time, he's also firing ATACMS ballistic missiles into Russia, right? I mean, that is a thing. The United States is firing ballistic missiles into Russia. Yeah, there's a fig leaf. There might be a Ukrainian in the room when the Americans are pushing the button, but it might as well be Trump firing ballistic missiles into Russia right now. Now, besides the fact that they're all being shot down because they're a pretty outdated system, as Russian electronic warfare is admitted pretty good, even in the Western mainstream media, of shutting down U.S. GPS signals and the air defense in general. But I mean, he's trying to, I think, leverage both sides here, right? Firing the ATACMS into Russia is meant to be the stick to the carrot to Russia. This corruption scandal. Oh my God, the Kiev regime is corrupt. I know everyone is terribly shocked by this. I mean, the entire world has admitted that the Kiev regime is the most corrupt country in Europe. As far as any, I think we can go back to at least the 2000s in that regard. But the green light has obviously been given, right, by the United States. I mean, I know some people have tried to present NABU as some type of independent corruption watch. There's nothing independent about it. It was set up and controlled by the United States and Europe, and the U.S. has the commanding heights in this. And obviously, a green light has been given to pressure Zelensky, obviously with regard to the timing of this deal. And they're taking down people extremely close to him who have had their hands in the cookie jar all along. Mindich, others, Yermak, Rustem Umarov, they've all been implicated, and the knives are out, right? Because there is no politics as normal within Ukraine, because they wiped out the whole political expression and view of Eastern Ukraine when they banned 21 opposition parties and charged the leaders of all the major opposition parties, with treason, and took total control of the media and so forth within the country. But there is politics within the Maidan milieu, within the regime itself. And we have seen the slighted oligarch Kolomoisky, we have seen Poroshenko, we have seen Klitschko, all, the knives are out for Zelensky. And this is obviously a green light from the United States pressuring.
So Piotr, I know there's a lot of points you moved to the corruption case as well, and touched on Pokrovsky. But just one question on the peace deal, though. It includes U.S. security guarantees for Ukraine. How would those look like if a peacekeeping force can't be present in Ukraine and Ukraine has to cut its military by half?
Well, but this is the point, Mario. It doesn't. You can't square that circle, right? Can you? You can't provide security assurances in Ukraine unless you have some form of ground forces there. That's why you've seen the British and the French particularly offering maybe to be the leaders of this, because the Russians have a particular emphasis on Washington. I mean, the British and the Russians don't exactly have a great relationship. The French and Russians historically have been pretty good. Well, it's more complex. But no, it doesn't work. What's a nuclear umbrella over Ukraine? Oh yeah, that's going to go down well in Moscow. So it's bollocks. To be as British as I can be, it's bollocks, and it's not going to be implemented. And this is the point: how far can you actually implement these things? Ukraine's not going to demilitarize, and of course, to Mark's point, it's all dependent on continued Western support. But Ukraine is innovating, and they are increasingly teaching NATO partners or whatever how to deal with drones or whatever. They are the innovators of this new form of warfare. But the critical counterpoint to that is that manpower. Ukraine has a manpower issue. That this new law that they changed, where now under 25-year-olds, I think, can leave the country. You've seen an exodus of people. Trust me, I was just in Morocco. Half the people who are in Morocco traveling around, Ukrainian. I was just in Cyprus. A hell of a load of Ukrainians out there, as well as Russians. Point I'm making is that a lot of Ukrainian, the core age group that would be needed to be conscripted or whatever, brought on to fight, are fleeing the country. And this is a problem. Now, I'm going to disagree with Mark. I don't think the Kiev regime is a regime. Is it Western backed? Of course. But Ukraine has had elections, whilst Russia has been dominated by the same person for the past 25 years, and not a particularly pleasant one. Yeah, I mean, as for the sort of the corruption thing, look, I've been to both countries in my past 30 years of existence. I've studied and lived in both. Ukraine has always been historically actually even more corrupt than Russia. But they have made steps in the past 10 years to improve that. And the fact that they are doing that, even the fact that this thing has even come to light, whether or not the Ukrainian government wanted it to, demonstrates that Ukrainians are improving. Again, it's relative. The Russians have been better marginally. If you look at something called Transparency Index International, they have an index where they rate countries out of corruption. 180 countries, Ukraine is 105 and Russia's 154. And Russia's has plummeted since the full-scale invasion. So both countries have issues, but this corruption, I think, is a problem. And it shows you normally where you see the corruption happening is at sort of junior officer level. So like people who are more the clerks or the sort of the local administrative types in the oblasts. But for it to be at the senior level, gold toilets, what the hell are they doing? And this is a huge problem because ultimately I care as much about Ukraine, but also the European project in the sense of this is why pro-Ukrainians think I have a problem with Ukraine because I'm skeptical of them joining NATO or EU. Not because I don't think they can in the future, but because I don't think they should right now. There's a lot of issues with Ukraine, and they're not ready to join either the EU or NATO because of their corruption and bureaucratic inefficiencies, etc. And if they did join, it'd be like Romania joining 10 years ago the EU. It was a disaster, at least initially, until they cleaned up their act. So, yeah, no, corruption is a huge systemic problem in Ukraine, but I don't think it's as some other people make it out to be. Like, let's look at Russia as well.
Final question on the peace plan. Likelihood, very quick question. Likelihood this will be accepted? Pyotr, you seem pretty skeptical.
Okay, I'll bet you 100 grand that it's not. I'm not going to do that. But like, it's not happening, Mario. No.
Mark, does Ukraine have a choice, especially with the progress that Russia's having? And we can move on to Pokrovsky and progress there. But does Ukraine have much of a choice? Or what do you think Ukraine and the EU would counter with?
There's always a choice. I mean, they can always mass forcibly conscript more people and throw them into the meat grinder as they've been doing, right? The Europeans can promise some level of support. Now, will it be effective? No, but they can carry on the conflict for months, if not years into the future. That can be done. And ultimately, Trump is going to be hobbled not so much by the Europeans and by the regime in Kiev, but by people within his own country, right? The bipartisan support of Congress, right, for conflict with Russia, by the media, by the blob, as Ben Rode calls it, the deep state, by people within his own administration, right? I think it's ultimately Trump who is not going to have a choice, not so much. I mean, Zelensky's a non-factor. I don't really see him as I mean, he is a clown, a comedian. He's playing a role.
We can move on to what's happening in Pokrovsky. We've seen this footage. It was like a Mad Max type scene where vehicles with the fog moving into the city. Russia's been talking about encircling Pokrovsky for, I think it's been weeks now, but the battles continue. It seems bound to fall. How significant is this? I know it was logistically significant a few months ago. Is that still the case? And how many losses has Russia faced taken over Pokrovsk? Because I keep getting different figures from different people I speak to. Pyotr, do you want to kick it off?
Right. Well, Pokrovsk is what back. Do you remember Bakhmut 18 months ago or whatever, a year and a half ago? Look, Pokrovsk is strategically important in a couple of ways. It is an important logistical hub for railways, and the Russians still continue to primarily use railways as their way of moving heavier military equipment, tanks, ATM, whatever, that sort of stuff, right? But second, it's also the gateway, some people say, to the fortress belt I mentioned earlier, right? These are a few other key, reasonably sized cities, urban areas that make up much of Donetsk Oblast, right? The point is that Russia's using this as a launch pad. If it can control Pokrovsk, it can use that as a launching pad to then try and push fully up. I think it's northwards because it's already got pressure on the south and the east or whatever to take over the whole of Donetsk Oblast, the remaining bit, which obviously is one of its key things. It's one of the territories it's protecting or liberating, right? To use Russian terminology. But this is a city of 60,000 people. Russia has accumulated, some estimates put double that, and they are losing in the realms of 500 to 800 casualties a day. Now, casualties is obviously deaths and injuries. We can't be verified of this. Some of these figures might be inflated, but they are losing people. And whether or not you think that they're inflated or undermined, the point is that this is it's not going to win the war. The war is going to continue for another year. We'll be here maybe next year talking about this. Maybe it'll be a different city. But the war will not be decided by whether Russia takes Pokrovsk. It will be decided by what happens in Russia's economy, Russia's government, or Western discontinuation of support for Ukraine. This is a war of economics as much as military kinetic.
What do you mean by What do you mean by Russia's government?
Putin doesn't have a great internal stability right now. We've seen that Lavrov disappeared, and I have colleagues of mine on Telegram channels who tell me that Lavrov might be being let go. I personally find that incredibly unlikely, but the point is, Putin is not in a stable situation. Of course, it's not as blown up as people make out in the Western media, like Putin's about to collapse, but the economy is not great. 24% of Russia's energy grid has been damaged, which does affect it. They've had to import stuff from China, which is absurd considering that this is what John McCain called the gas station, not a country, it's just a glorified gas station, whatever the quote was. So Russia is in a tough stretch. And if the combination of economic pressure, sanctions, discontinuation of supplies to India and China, it is squeezing the Russian economy. And if Ukraine strikes on oil infrastructure, if Ukraine continues that with all these different elements, it's not easy for the Russians to sustain their war economy. And therefore their frontline activities. This is not going to happen overnight. I'm not claiming to say that Russia's done, of course not. But that's where the war is more decided, not whether or not you take another hay bale or another city, unless Ukraine's side implodes.
Mark, a lot of points here to go through, starting with Pokrovsky, but also talking about Putin's grip on power. I think there's been about 23 generals that were purged since the war began. So obviously, if you look at Western countries, the number is pretty close to zero. And we have Lavrov that's also disappeared. And we've got strikes on Russia's oil refineries and the sanctions as well, both from India, cutting Russian oil imports by 50%, and Chinese state companies also cutting their imports from the two large Russian exporters. Your thoughts on all these points?
Okay, so first of all, Pokrovsky, I think Pyotr hit a lot of the salient points there. The only thing I think he really misses the topography importance is that Pokrovsky is heights. It is commanding heights, both towards the valleys of the Kiev regime's last defensive line in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, but also to the west. To the west, Russia, after Pokrovsky, enters operational space, where there is no significant geographic barrier, no urban agglomerations, nothing, all the way to Pavlograd and the banks of the Dnieper River. So that is going to be continuing to be a huge bleeding sore for the Kiev regime. And I mean, their whole southern flank is collapsing as well. With the Russian advances, the encirclement of Goloya Polya, which is progressing extremely fast and moves on Horeov. The Kiev regime does not have enough manpower, as Pyotr said. They're not able to mass forcibly conscript enough of their people. They're fleeing whenever they can the country. Very few people, other than the committed, Banderite fascist ideologues, want to fight and die for this regime willingly. And that's why you've seen this mass exodus of Ukrainians to Europe, millions of them in Russia. That is the reality, and they can't plug the hole everywhere.
How significant do you think the Russian casualties are in capturing Pokrovsky?
I don't think they are anywhere comparable to the Kiev regime casualties. In fact, we've heard multiple reports in the Western mainstream media by Ukrainian commanders talking how they never even see the enemy. They're hit by FABs, they're hit by artillery, they're hit by drones. The Russians are, standing off. They have an excessive ability of long-range strikes, advantages across the board. Whether we're talking air power, whether we're talking artillery, whether we're talking the numbers and increasingly the quality of drones. They don't have to engage the Kiev regime's forces. In counter battles, the number of casualties that are inflicted by small arms, it's like 6% of the casualties. And that's pretty much actually on both sides. So Russia in the terms of this conflict, is suffering very light casualties now, and they always have. I mean, there's been an incredible amount of just absolutely absurd propaganda about casualty numbers. And the best measure of that, to keep your pulse on this, is the Western funded InfoWar outlet, Media Zona, that has can't find more than 100, and I think that the last time I checked was 130,000 KIA in Russia, which is a terrible number, a tragic number, in and of itself. But with the geopolitical stakes, the world order essentially being decided, or very likely to be decided ultimately by this conflict,
You're saying
there's
130,000
really no
casualties since when? Since when exactly?
since the beginning of this conflict.
Total
Not
casualties for Russia.
KIA,
Hey,
not
deaths.
there's
This is why it's very high jump. Like this is where I struggle a lot when I speak. And I think you see that as well, Mark.
We live in
Exactly.
different factual realities, right?
No, I
there's
see exactly.
There's a reality where Russians are running out of tanks, running out of rations, running out of
But they are.
missiles, fighting with shovels. They have no morale. I mean, this is the reality that Western mainstream media has been trying to shovel, like feces, into our brains for the last few years. But it's the reality on the battlefield. With essentially, Russia's not just demilitarizing the Kiev regime in Ukraine; they've effectively demilitarized much of NATO at this point.
I was looking forward to the debate section. I think we arrived at it, right? Look, I'm surprised by how much you and I, Mark, have agreed on certain points. But come on, the Russians are really going to go head to head with the whole of the NATO alliance, right? I don't support everything about NATO, just to be clear. But just what tit for tat? Most of the European members of NATO are not even in war economies. If we put literally the same footing of Russia in a wartime economy where they're spending 30% of their entire GDP on defense expenditure.
What era is that? Because that's not right now.
It is. They're spending upwards of $147 billion. And the biggest problem with spending all your money on defense expenditure is it doesn't have any longer term supply side effects. That's the basics of economics, because half the equipment that they produce is destroyed, lost, reacquired by the enemy forces. It doesn't have long term benefits, right? I think we can agree that Russia has the momentum, to use a keyword I think there, in Pokrovsky. But they are putting all their emphasis on the Eastern Front from a military standpoint in Ukraine, to the point where Trump has managed to negotiate an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, which is basically a preset for a defense peace plan or whatever, between Azerbaijan and Armenia and Turkey. Turkey is taking over the Caucasus, basically. They are the regional hegemon there now. Why? Because Russia is so stretched in Ukraine, they can't even come to the defense of Armenia in the past 3 years. Armenia activated the CSTO, or Collective Security Treaty Organization, and Russia didn't do shit. And that's because they can't, right? What has Russia done?
Why would they do anything?
The aid of, where was Russia for Bashar
occupied Azerbaijani territory?
Where was Putin when Bashar al-Assad collapsed? Where was he for his long-standing supporter in Syria? Nowhere, because all his forces are tied up in Ukraine. Even Russia's failing in Mali, in the Sahel, because they can't get their shit together in Ukraine. So to claim that the Russians are doing well, or that they're not suffering losses of a significant size, is idiotic. It's just silly. Ukraine is suffering a lot. I'm not denying that, but to deny Russia's not suffering is just dark.
Very little reality to the description that is going on here. Pyotr suggested that this conflict was ultimately going to be decided by economy, right? Because it is a war of attrition. That is the type of war that Russia has waged from the beginning. But it's not Russia's economy that is teetering on the brink of collapse. It is the West's. Germany is in recession. The United Kingdom and France, their own ministers are talking about the needs to take IMF bailouts. The United States is also teetering on the edge of recession, and Trump's idea of waging some tariff war against the world has resulted in him being bitch slapped over a barrel by China. And the U.S. is not in a very good economic situation. It's the opposite. And the Kiev regime has no economy, right? It is entirely dependent on $100 billion worth of handouts every year to keep the lights on in the regime and the conscription press gangs trolling the streets, right? It is going to be decided economically, but there's a completely different reality of where the weakness on the side of this conflict is.
Okay, if I can make a couple points to that. So firstly, yeah, sure. No one's denying that the West has issues. I'm currently coming to you from London, which is a dump. Everyone's trying drastically to see the state of the UK as, it's not that bad. No, it's a shit show right now. The UK economy is a joke. And a lot of Western economies are struggling. But that does not negate the fact that Russia's struggling, right? Russia is having to import energy from China. They are having to cut costs on pensions, which is something Putin really doesn't want to do because one of his biggest supporter bases is the older rural communities of Russia. Not a good idea. Also, to your point about America, I mean, we're flip-flopping. Right now, we've got Marco Rubio, who's gung-hoing for America to just get stuck into a forever war in Venezuela. So, yeah, it's not exactly a great idea, but I think this is where I get frustrated by not necessarily just you, but like people who are like, Ukraine can win everything. No, they can't. It's not that simple. But equally on the Russian side, Russia's fine. They're crippling the Ukrainians. And trust me, I worked on one of the most critical reports during my time at the World Bank on, and yes, you could say I'm part of the deep state or globalist hegemon or whatever bollocks, but it gave me direct experience when it comes to the true costs to rebuild Ukraine. Now, they've done reiterations of this report over the past couple of years, but the first one was in August of 2022, and the low estimate was $500 billion to rebuild the Ukrainian economy completely. Now, there are a few things like turning it into net zero. But anyway, in comparison, in modern money, the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, all of Europe, by the Americans in 1948, 9, whatever, was 147 billion. So we're talking about 3.5 times, almost the cost of the Marshall Plan, just to build one singular country, which is insane. So both countries are screwed right now. And my biggest concern as someone who has Russian heritage is also the demographic impact. Right? This is going to cost the Russian people, the Russian population, tons. And ultimately, there's one country that is benefiting from all of this, which is China. And I'm very concerned about the potential. China's looking at Manchuria with, interest. Maybe they'll annex the territory in eastern China, in Russia.
Ooh, yellow peril. Ooh, so
Maybe.
scared.
Maybe.
This is such a colonialist copium trope, to try to demonize China on the way out of this. But there's one thing that we agree on is that the cost of rebuilding Ukraine is going to be completely devastated at the end of this conflict. And I don't believe that we're anywhere near the end of this conflict. There's a whole world of destruction ahead, quite unfortunately. And
just a point.
My wife is Crimean. I have family all over Ukraine. So I'm very familiar with the state of the people. We've got family in Kharkov, in Odessa, in Donbass, and the cost of reconstruction of this country after this really devastating conflict is going to be crippling for whoever controls what or whatever is left of Ukraine at the end of it.
Pyotr, just one argument being made that Putin wants to continue this war because his economy has become dependent on the war economy. Do you agree with that argument? And second, how does that argument make sense? Because a peace deal would definitely include lifting of sanctions and probably certain business dealings with the US as the Russian economy opens up. So wouldn't that be more lucrative than the current war economy?
Of course it is. I think having studied Russia in my master's, like one of the things that I've really come to appreciate is the different mindsets Putin's, as he's gotten older, he's gone through sort of revisements, also because of exogenous factors like Bush's statements over Ukraine and Georgia joining, which led to the 2008 Georgian war, or the 2012 Snow Revolution, or the Maidan events in 2014. But what is, so I mainly used to think of Putin as largely a strategist, pragmatist. But he clearly has some more ideological drives here. And I think he's put so much emphasis on taking all of Ukraine, forcing Ukraine to pivot back eastwards. Because ultimately, this is why it is a proxy war, at least ideologically, because Ukraine is in a tug of war. It's in a tug of war between the West and Russia. Russia doesn't want to lose Ukraine, and where obviously there's a lot of historical significance with Novgorod and Kievan Rus and all that sort of stuff, but also because it's the strategical influence of America gets even more power, undermining Russian security interests. And you've got another country, the biggest European nation other than Russia, with NATO potentially. Russia does feel surrounded. Containment policy of the Cold War. I get it. But Putin's put so much emphasis on this ideologically, I think, that he can't let go. He doesn't want to let go. His entire legacy now as the protector, as the upholder of as the mighty Russian Empire or whatever Russian state depends on it now. I mean, obviously, it would make sense. Probably cut your losses. At the end of the day, the war will stop. All Russia has to do is leave Ukraine. And if they really want to hold referendum, they can do that. I'm not against referendum in the sense of like, do it through the UN. That's where the UN has a role, right? If you want to talk about whether the oblasts in the East want to suddenly become a part of Greater Russia, okay, that's not exactly an easy conversation to have. But in a perfect world, that's what will be held. We have it in the Security Council, we have the UN mandate, and then it's done. And then if they want to go off to Russia, then that's how it works under international law. But because Putin invaded, that's all completely gone out the window. And so Putin's ultimate, I agree with you in the sense of I think his longer term benefit would be to just call it quits or just pause, just stop the fighting, don't even withdraw. And then Trump will say, well, Putin's not seeking war anymore. We'll lift some sanctions. And then you'll get more businesses coming back in. I know for a fact from friends of mine in Moscow that there are plenty of Western outlets, Prada being one, I don't know, loads of fashion brands, high-end retail brands that the Russians love, with their shops. They're completely empty, but the electricity is paid for, the lights are on. They're just waiting. They're just waiting and trying to hold out for when the situation becomes normalized enough that they can just go back in and do business, which will benefit Putin much more. But I think it's not so much about the pragmatism as it is his ideological, personal obsession with it now.
Mark, there's a point that Pyotr made earlier about Putin's grip on power right now. We've seen reports about all the generals being purged throughout the war since the war began. I think the number was 23. You could just Google that to make sure it's accurate. And we've also got the U.S. sanctions on Russia. We've got the U.S. sanctions on Russia, as well as on Rosneft and Lukoil, and India cutting oil imports by about 50% by the end of the year. How much of an impact do you think that will have on the Russian economy?
Yeah, we know because Reuters has reported on this. The Russian refining has year-on-year decreased by 3%. That's the extent of Zelensky's much heralded long-range strike campaign against Russia's energy.
Only 3%.
3%. That's Reuters, right? I mean, that
Pyotr, have you seen that? Pyotr, just on that before we continue, that's a pretty significant point. Only 3% drop in Russian oil refining after all these Ukrainian strikes.
Well, that's what the Russians tell us. Also, I might point out that Reuters is a Western media outlet. Reuters is a Western media outlet. I thought you didn't take your information or believe what the mainstream media says in the West, Mark.
Oh, there's always a few pearls amongst the swine.
Okay, just
right, so if these numbers are accurate, it's pretty concerning.
It makes your point, the point that you want.
But if these numbers are accurate, though, that'll be pretty concerning because that's Ukraine's main strategy right now, striking Russian oil refineries. But I'd be surprised if that number is accurate.
But Mario, that doesn't make sense because if you're cutting energy supplies to India and China, but then your overall oil production isn't being that hit, how do you square that circle to right again? And also, a key point here, and that comes from, well, someone very close to me, actually, related to me, which is Russia does utilize a lot of Western pieces for profiling grounds, doing exploration, all that sort of stuff, before even getting into digging ground. Russia has lost the capacity to utilize those components, hardware, because they've lost Western components or updates, if you're talking digital stuff, whatever. So Russia is, I would be amazed if Russia is somehow outputting the same. It isn't. And we can see that from the trade declines that are going on with its two main partners, let alone smaller ones like Iran, North Korea, or other countries in the Middle East.
Okay, agree to disagree. The very best thing that has happened out of this entire conflict is Russia decoupling itself economically and politically from the West. With regards to generals, yes, a number of generals have been purged because Russia is rooting out their own corruption. And Putin has taken advantage of this. Lavrov didn't disappear to anywhere. He didn't attend one Security Council meeting because Russia was following the US example when they gather so many of their own important officials, considering that the Kiev regime has openly stated by their psychopathic military intelligence, the Banderite Budanov, that they have attempted multiple times to assassinate Putin and have attempted to assassinate Russian leaders, as well as hundreds, if not thousands, across former parts of Ukraine. That they kept Lavrov out of the Security Council meeting on purpose, so that if there was some attempt at a decapitation strike by the Kiev regime or the US through them, that the Russian government would continue. I mean, I understand there's a lot of hopium and copium, to imagine that there's some kind of split. I mean, it's a perennial of liberal Russians, as self-exiles in the West and the like. But there's absolutely no reality to it whatsoever.
Can I just make one, Mark? I've got to disagree with you though, mate, because surely someone like you, who's as aware of the technicalities and depth of the Russian Siloviki, right? Lavrov's not in the inner circle of Putin. Therefore, he would not be the man to replace him if there was a what the hell did you say? Decapitate. He's not going to be the designated survivor, that's for sure. So he wasn't included because he's not in the inner circle of Putin's Siloviki. It's not because he's important.
I don't think you really understand the Russian Security Council and what it is as a body.
Siloviki, yeah.
It's not okay. All right. I again a trope. Did you get this from Soldatov? I mean, is this his crib notes? I don't know. So,
mate, look, the point is, Lavrov is not part of the inner circle. He's not going to be the person to continue Putin's government because he's not close enough. That's my point.
Do you think, Mark? Do you think that Putin is? I know people love
Secretary of Education would carry on the U.S. government. It's a contingent.
Mark, I know people would love to talk about Putin either being sick or losing power. Is there any indication?
How many diseases has Putin suffered, according to the Western mainstream media, over the last cancer, Alzheimer's, diabetes? I mean, we've heard. I've even heard rabies. I mean, I think that was the Daily Mail, but so Putin, I would venture to say, is in better physical and mental health than Donald Trump, and I'll just leave it at that. I know a lot of people in the West hope that he would just pass from this mortal coil, but I don't really see it happening anytime soon.
And gentlemen, as a final point, that was the news headlines were all dominated by the Russian incursions into NATO that continue to this day. And NATO's limited response, if at all, I think sending out $1 million missiles for every $20,000 drawn by Russia. What do you think what's the reason for these incursions? Is Russia probing NATO defenses? Is it used as a negotiating tactic? And what are your thoughts on NATO's response, Pyotr?
Let Mark go first. I want to know what he says.
That's cheap. Yeah, there is no incursion. Right, there is no. I mean, this hysteria that has been whipped up. Right. I mean, how many people have been arrested now in Germany for flying drones? Or in Norway, that turns out to be normal drones flying. There has been. This is an obvious attempt by a European political ruling class that is desperate that they're losing this conflict and that their big brother in the Trump administration is walking away from them, attempting and failing to create an escalation that would draw the U.S. back further into the conflict the way they see it. There has been no incursions, right? The Kiev regime did, it seems, cobble together a couple of Gerbera plywood and fiberglass decoy drones, and in at least one case, actually physically deposit in Poland this wonderful shot of a Gerbera drone sitting untouched on top of a chicken coop. It was absolutely absurd. There's no reality to any of this, right? It is pure false flag and hysteria. And I know there is no decoy drone threat to Europe.
If it is a false flag, which I think I know Pyotr wouldn't agree, but if it is a false flag, what's the purpose of it?
What is the purpose of it is to attempt to escalate the situation and draw the U.S. further back into the conflict. It failed completely.
To sabotage the peace negotiations and get the U.S. to continue supporting Ukraine.
We're already talking. This is already a month in the hindsight, right? And there, I understand there's an attempt to drag this nonsense out a little bit further. But that is an ongoing effort by the Europeans and by the Kiev regime. Sure.
And we've got Pyotr, the railway sabotage as well in Poland just a few days ago.
Oh boy. Okay. I'll just say to my contradictory friend that firstly, one of the biggest talking points on the Russian side is that it was Boris Johnson that went to Ukraine to tell them not to capitulate and agree to the deal.
That's completely false. That's completely false. We agree on that.
Oh, okay, interesting. But I was going to say that I'm still getting over how much we've actually agreed tonight. No, but what I would say is sort of the Ukrainian false flag attempts with some plywood and stuff. If the Ukrainian military was that incompetent, and they would have collapsed by now, but they haven't. And also, Russia is incurred it. Look, okay, let's go through them systematically. We've had drones in Poland. We've had MiGs in Estonian airspace. We've had some other stuff in Romania. And now we've had railways affected in Poland. I'm not saying whether it's Russia. I'm just saying these are things that have been claimed to happen, right?
You don't think, do you think it is Russia?
I'll come to that. And the last one, this will answer your question.
We know it was Ukrainian. That's been admitted. It was Ukrainian.
Right, okay. So right now, the Russians on a ship called the Yantar off the coast of Scotland were firing or shooting lasers at Royal Air Force pilots in Britain. Okay? This is without a question Russian, because we've seen this boat go to and from the Arctic sphere and so forth. It's Russian. Okay? They say, and also because Russia says it's a boat that is to do with ocean scientific navigation. Okay, why do you have lasers on it? Well, maybe for deep sea analysis? I'm not sure that's that useful. Anyway, point I'm making is if Russia's active in UK waters, which the Royal Navy are having to sort of deal with.
UK territorial waters? I don't think so. They're not. They're not in
They are. The Russians have said that they're in the waters, bro. Also, because, look, just hear me out and then we can go back and forth. I know Mario wants to end probably, but this is known as the GI UK gap, right? Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. And it's one of the most important strategical entry points for the Russian submarines into the North Atlantic, right? And the reason why Scotland can't ever leave the UK, if you've ever been interested, is because it would be a strategical absolute blow to not just the UK security interests, but NATO's broader nuclear deterrence, because UK is one of the 3 member nuclear states and Trident submarine system. Anyway, point I'm making is the Russians do a lot of shit around there. They were there in January. They were there in November. They've been there about 7-8 times in the past 3-4 years. Just bobbing about for oceanific scientific purposes, apparently, which is not. Anyway, the bottom point is that this is Russia, because we know that because they've admitted it. And the company that runs the boat that is bobbing around Britain is owned by or operated by an organization which commands to the Russian Armed Forces, or MOD. So it's quite clearly a little bit more than that. And if they're fucking around with Britain, then they're going to be screwing around in the Baltics and in Eastern Europe, especially Moldovan elections and other stuff. If you can't just acknowledge that, whether or not you think Ukraine's capable of winning this war or not, you are lying to yourself. The Russians are probing. They're probing around because they want to see what NATO will do.
If a ray of sunshine falls in one part of the world, then it illuminates the entirety of the world, right? I mean, this isn't any type of serious argument. So I'm just going to leave it at that.
But I literally countered your point, and you haven't said anything to counter mine. So,
and Kyiv, can you touch on as well the latest sabotage in Poland, the railway sabotage that happened in Poland?
Look, these are events that Russians will either pay dissidents, groups of people who are pro. Keep in mind, Poland has a much pro-Russian line, right? The PIS party or the PIS party are one of the more empathetic or sympathetic sides in Europe towards Russia's perspective, like Viktor Orban or Robert, whatever his name is, in Fico in Slovakia, etc., etc. They are one of the more pro. So it doesn't push. It's not beyond the stretch of the mind to imagine that the Russians either paid some independent actors to do this, or they were somehow in Poland's territory, which they have been. The Russians have encroached on Poland's territory in the past, and so what? By targeting a railway, what is it? It's symbolic. It's a nuisance, but it's not enough for the NATO alliance to really be able to do stuff. What the NATO alliance aren't going to suddenly impose a no-fly zone over parts of Russia, because so the Russians are pushing the boundaries there. This is called hybrid war. It's called asymmetrical warfare. This is what the Russians are trying to do to see just how far they can get away with. But this is serious, because they're beginning to do more than just air. There's one thing flying about in the air and people see you like, psychological warfare. If you're targeting railway tracks, that's not good, because then they do that more, and then suddenly, because also Poland is one of the key suppliers of stuff to Ukraine. So if the Russians can sabotage enough railways in eastern Poland, then that does have a supply link-ish impact on Ukraine. But if they do that, then that is an attack or some kind of assault or something on Poland, which is Article 5, Article 4, all this sort of stuff in NATO. It's not to be sniffed at.
Mark, final comments on this latest event in Poland. What Tusk called, as he identified the perpetrators, are 2 Ukrainian citizens who have been cooperating with Russian intelligence services for a long time. But the railway does supply aid to Ukraine, so it doesn't impact Ukraine directly. You think Russia's behind this?
Okay, let's have a moment of no bullshit honesty, right? Both sides are conducting and have been conducting sabotage attacks against each other for the entirety of this conflict, and paying people on the other side to do it, or blackmailing or scamming them, right? I mean, this is a regular thing where Russian pensioners are tricked by Ukrainian scammers working for the regime to do acts of sabotage within Russia, right? And yes, there are people who, for ideological reasons, there are literally hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, well, at least 100,000, that have fought on the Russian side in this conflict against the regime in Kiev, right? I mean, there is a degree of this. But I can tell you something, that Russia has been much more careful and effective when it has conducted. There have been detonations at ammunition factories, both in the United States and across Europe, as there have been, quote unquote, accidents in Russia, right? Industrial, right? That are, although certainly some of them were caused by Russian operatives, Russian agents, assets, and likewise on the other side. But this clumsy thing, Russia has never attempted any sabotage against railway lines, because if there's one thing the conflict has made clear in Ukraine, is how easily it is to repair rail lines. Once again, I do believe that there were Ukrainians who did this, but once again, I'm, they just escaped. We don't know where they are now. Yeah, okay. But they left a calling card that it was Ukrainians working for Vladimir Putin. I'm quite sure that there was a psychological aspect to this, but it was by the Kiev regime, and they're once again attempting to increase the level of escalation and hysteria in Europe. And the European leaders are quite amenable to that.
Why would the Ukrainians target one of the main supply lines that supports their defense?
Mario himself just said that it is not a supply line to supplies into Ukraine. Right? Can we agree on that?
Is a railway line used to transport aid to Ukraine?
That's what he said it is.
Yeah, it is supplying aid to Ukraine. Mark, the argument you're making, though, is very easy to repair. So that makes it a good false flag attack if it's easy to repair, a good symbolic attack to increase. And I think the point that, Pyotr, your question is, why would they do that? Is
Well, it
to
takes away
increase
manpower, it
support.
takes away resources, time, energy, money to repairing it. When okay, if Mark wants to go with that logic, that's fine, but that's not logical to me.
You stand with that position, Mark? You think it's most likely a false flag attack?
Yeah, I think it's most likely a false flag. But in the ultimate scope of thing, I don't even know why we're arguing about such a piddling thing in the scale of this conflict, to be perfectly honest.
Gentlemen, absolute pleasure to have you both. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Mario. Take
Thanks
care.
for working with us.